Hello, and welcome to Your Best Unleashed. I am your host, Stephanie Jackman. I want to thank you for taking this opportunity to join me today for today's episode. If you have not had the opportunity to subscribe to my channel, I'm going to ask you to do so at this time. Please hit that notification button, and when I am on live, you will be notified. For those of you all that have been hanging out with me for several episodes, I want to thank you for your time and your commitment to Your Best Unleashed. I also want to thank you for taking the opportunity to share this broadcast with your community. So we are going to jump right into today's episode. Today's episode is the journey of grief. And today's episode is quite different from previous episodes. So our episode on depression and anxiety. Some individuals may struggle with depression and anxiety, but individuals may not have. Well, it's different with grief. Grief is a universal human experience that at some point we all will have to face that journey. So today we're going to take some time to just speak about grief and loss. Grief and loss is a universal language throughout all cultures, and it's felt with every heart. It may feel different, it may look different, but it is a universal experience. So let's jump right in and discuss the journey of grief. For today's purposes and for today's episode, how we are going to define grief is love that has no place to go. So it's trapped inside of us with nowhere to go. Our loved one has now passed away, and we still have all this love for them, and it has nowhere to go. For today's episode, as we're talking about grief, there's many things that we can grieve or have lost. So we could grieve, again, loved ones. We could grieve the loss of a job. We could grieve the loss of a home. We could grieve the loss of a child. As we age and go through the maturation process, we could grieve human faculties and abilities. But for today's purposes, we are specifically going to talk about the grief of a loved one. So again, that is a universal experience. That was evident in COVID and the COVID pandemic. So no matter where we were in the world, we all experienced some type of grief during that 2.5-year pandemic. So whether we were here in the United States, whether we were in England or Canada or the Caribbean, it didn't matter where we were. But as a nation, as a universe, as a world, we all experienced some form of grief. And oftentimes here in the United States, it was in masses. And so that type of grief can certainly be traumatic. Okay. So as a result, we're going to talk a little bit first and foremost about the 5 stages of grief. Again, these 5 stages of grief are universal. So let's jump right into the 5 stages of grief. The first stage of grief is denial. And with the stage of denial, this is where sadness can come. This is where avoidance can come. This is where shock can come. That those of us that are survivors of the loss of our loved one is dealing with the fact that they are no longer with us, even though we may have experienced a diagnosis 3, 6, 8, 9 months ago. And now the day has come where we've actually lost our loved one and they have taken their final breath and we've spent our final moments with them. There's still no preparation for that last final breath. So we can be in a place of denial. Also, how did our loved one pass away? Again, it could have been a long terminal illness. It could have been death by an unfortunate homicide. It could have been death by suicide. It could have been a car accident. It could have been a number of things, but still, there is this stage of denial that we may go through, this stage of shock that we may go through in an effort to be able to avoid the reality of what is next. Now, in the stage of denial, it's key to also understand that many individuals may not experience denial, but many individuals may. Okay, so the first stage is denial. The second stage of grief is anger. This is the stage where we're upset, we're frustrated. Perhaps we can even be upset with the deceased that they've left us. And why did they leave us? Asking all these types of questions that, again, there's no answer for. Okay. We also may be angry with ourselves, feeling as though that there's more that we could have done. If I could have just done more, if I would have just been more attentive. So feeling as though we're angry with ourselves. And then also anger towards God. Yes, God. We're angry at God that our loved one is no longer with us. Now, this is something that I often will speak with my patients about, that it is okay for us to be angry at God in a time of grief. His shoulders are big enough to handle it, and he knows that we're angry. He knows us, so he knows that we are angry. And as we move through this process of grief and through the healing process, some of those feelings of anger towards ourselves, towards our deceased loved one, and as well as our feelings of anger towards God will begin to subside and we'll move into a space of healing. And we'll talk more about that healing space shortly. The third stage of grief is bargaining. This is where we will attempt to negotiate, or perhaps we will attempt to even make deals, right? So we will get a prognosis of 3 to 6 months, and we will say, God, if you just heal me or heal my loved one, I will serve you for the rest of my life. God, if you just give me more time with them. And when we're talking about our loved ones, it's never enough time. So no matter how much time that we have, is still never enough, because we never want to see ourselves or can envision or imagine our lives without them. So we're bargaining. God, take me instead. We're bargaining in terms of there's other people out there that you could take. We haven't had that much time together. We just got married. They're so young. All of those things are bargaining. And those are signs when we're talking about the stage of bargaining. That is the first indication that we are beginning to come to terms with perhaps what the situation is and what we may be facing. So that is bargaining. The fourth stage is depression. Depression is the stage where it happens over time. So it's not abrupt, it's not immediate, it just happens over time in terms of moving into this is our reality. This is where we are at this particular time. This is the new situation. And that happens over time. So there's this sadness that comes upon us of the loss of our loved one, even perhaps our own terminal illness or diagnosis that we have been faced with. Now, this type of depression, as it pertains to grief, is different than just clinical depression. This depression is more of a situational or circumstantial around grief, which is different than the clinical depression. Okay. Next, the final stage is acceptance. And the stage of grief around acceptance is where we are moving into this is my new situation. This is my new circumstances without my loved one. This is my new reality of what I am looking to face at this particular point. Now, it's key and critical to understand that acceptance doesn't mean we've moved completely into the healing process. It just means that acceptance, that this is our new normal. And when we're discussing grief, there comes a point in time where we have to face the creation of a new normal, life without our loved one. Okay, so this is where acceptance and recovery becomes more of a reality. What do I mean by that? That means that we may be more open and honest about speaking the pain that we are experiencing due to the loss of our loved one. Acceptance may mean this is where we are willing to perhaps seek out a grief therapist. Acceptance may mean this is where we are actually willing to attend a grief support group. Acceptance is the stage where perhaps we are open and beginning to move into creating a new normal for our lives without our loved one. The acceptance stage is really the stage where we begin to now focus on us and the future. That's where the healing begins to start. Wherein the four previous stages of denial, anger, bargaining, and depression is really about our deceased loved one and what was behind us. So that piece in terms of the acceptance stage is really, really key. Now, I also want to highlight for everyone that there is also grief that is called anticipatory grief. What anticipatory grief is that feelings of grief that have not actually happened, but we are anticipating the feelings as a result of a pending loss or death. Meaning, again, we've been given 3 months, we've been given 6 months, we've been given 9 months. So as a result, our bodies and our mind begins to shift into anticipating grief. But again, there's really no preparation for loss and grief, no matter how short or no matter how long. Now, I've always shared with you that I would be transparent in our episodes of Your Best Unleashed. And Your Best Unleashed is really designed to be able to help anchor you to be your best mentally, spiritually, physically, and emotionally. And I know that this is a heavy topic, but it is a well needed topic because, again, grief is a universal human experience. And I'm going to share a little bit about my own personal experiences around grief. So, back in 2007, 2007, I lost my father. He passed away. And I had never lost a parent before. So my mom is still alive, but losing my father was definitely a pain that I had not experienced before. And even now, as you look at going back 17 years later, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about my father in some shape, form, or fashion. 17 years later. So it's something that I will hear, something that I will see, something that I will remember that causes me to think about him on a daily basis. So I can think about the day that he passed away and I got the news. That day is etched in my mind. I think about and I remember the day that we had his homegoing service and his celebration of life service. I think about his birthday. So, all of those are things in which are normal when we're talking about the grieving process, right? So, grief can be a very uncomfortable topic. And oftentimes, when we're grieving, people want to provide a degree of comfort, but they don't know what to say. Because oftentimes, when things are said around grief, it's really they're saying things to make themselves feel comfortable in a discomfort. They mean well, but grief can be so uncomfortable, and people want to provide you with a degree of comfort and reassurance. But oftentimes, when we comment or when we extend condolences, we may not know what to say or how to say it. We mean well, but how many of us can be honest and we've heard or we've even said things such as, you will feel better in time. It will get better over time. They're in a better space now. They're in a better place now. They lived a long life. They're no longer suffering. Stop crying. It's going to be okay. And again, we mean well, but all of those things are oftentimes things that we say in order to make us feel better. So people say, stop crying. Stop crying because that makes us feel comfortable. When in actuality, I will tell people crying is therapeutic and it's good for you. So if you need to cry, cry. It's okay. When you hear someone say, oh, they lived a long life. Yeah, perhaps they did. But I still miss them. I still want them here with me. Well, at least they're in a better place now. Yeah. They're with the Lord. They're resting. They're in heaven. But the selfish side of me would say, I still would like them here with me. I wanted more time. There were things that we talked about that we were going to do together, or we had so many plans, right? So again, oftentimes people, again, our family, our friends, our coworkers, They mean well, but oftentimes we will say things in a space of grief that is to make us feel better because it can be a very uncomfortable space. Okay. So, we're going to talk a little bit about how do we begin to memorialize and honor our loved ones as we're moving through the stages of grief? How do we honor them? How do we take care of ourselves? Because that's key and critical, is taking care of ourselves even during this time period to where we actually have to create a new normal, particularly if we're talking about the loss of a spouse, particularly if we're talking about the loss of a parent who we may have been the caregiver for, particularly if we're talking about the loss of a child, a minor child who was in our home, who we were the primary caregiver for, or a grandparent or a family member that lived with us and we provided care for. Even some of our patients, if we're in the healthcare field, how do we begin to create that new normal? And again, it takes time. So I tell my patients all the time, there is no time frame on the grieving process. There's no time frame. So there's no 6 months and you should be done, a year and you should be done, 3 years and you should be done. Nope. The grieving process is just that. It is a process and it looks different for all of us. So I'm going to talk more a little bit about what I mean when I say there's no time frame before we wrap up today's episode of Your Best Unleashed. So let's talk a little bit now about how do you memorialize your loved one? So we're moving through the stages of grief. And for the stages of grief, there again is no time frame. So it's not, 3 days you're in denial, 2 months you're in the stage of anger, 6 months you're in the stage of bargaining, 3 weeks you're in the stage of depression, and then you move into acceptance. It's not that. Okay. It's so key and critical to understand again that grief moves in waves, right? So waves, meaning one day you could be feeling depressed, and then the next day you could be in a space of denial. Then 3 or 4 days later, you could be angry. So it moves in waves, right? That piece is really key to understand. So as we've moved through the stages of grief, and now we are moving into a space of acceptance, where we are looking to create a new normal for ourselves without our loved one. We are looking to take it day by day, step by step, without our loved one, as opposed to kind of being stuck and paralyzed. How do we memorialize them? This is key because we want to honor them. We want to celebrate them. And so there's many ways that we can do that. Over time, I have facilitated grief support groups, and individuals that have gone through the grief support group have came back, or I have seen them in stores or at church, and they've said, the group was really helpful for me because it gave me an opportunity to share the space with other people that were grieving, when oftentimes when we are grieving, we feel like we are the only one. We feel like we are alone in this process. So how do we begin to shift and celebrate and memorialize our loved ones? Well, I have several things that we can look at and begin to do, again, as we're moving to that stage of acceptance. That is so key. So, one way is again a celebration of life, a memorial service. Okay, the old name that many people can refer to as a funeral. But we have moved from funeral to celebration of life, a memorial service, a homegoing service. That's one way to memorialize. That's one way to where you can celebrate your loved one, not just you yourself, but those that are closest to you, as well as those that are closest to the deceased and loved them wholeheartedly. Next, make a donation to a cause in which was near and dear to your loved one's heart. I had a dear friend that I worked with for many, many years. She passed away. She passed away from cancer. And so every year, our company makes a donation to the Cancer Society in her name. Okay. So that's one way that you can be able to help memorialize your loved one. If your loved one was cremated, you can have cremation jewelry made. So many people will have necklaces made and they're carrying around their loved one's ashes with them, feeling near and dear to them. They may also have their loved one's ashes in their home or in an intimate space. That's another way to be able to memorialize your loved one. Keepsake boxes. Keepsake boxes are you putting treasures in those in boxes that will remind you and that will help you be able to remember your loved one that's passed. So it can be anything that was significant and important to them, as well as anything that you and that individual shared with each other. If your loved one has been buried, you can go and visit their grave site. That's another way to memorialize them. You can plant flowers. You can have a headstone. Those are all ways to memorialize your loved ones. Another way, create a scholarship in your loved one's honor. So if it's with a school that they have attended, if it's through your church, if it's through a specific trade in which they were a professional of, so the National Association of Social Workers or psychiatry or nursing or whatever it is, whatever your loved one's occupation was, you can create a scholarship in your loved one's name. Plant a tree or create a memorial garden, whether that's on your property or in another area. You can also donate and memorialize a bench in a park if they were a veteran. Create it in their park in a memorial in their honor. You can also take items of your loved one and create a quilt. So that could be pictures of your family and your loved one together. And then you can have a quilt. It can be articles of their clothing. And you can put them together, patches all together, and have a quilt created in their honor. Okay, there's so many ways that you can honor and memorialize and celebrate our loved ones' lives. Don't forget celebrating those anniversaries and those birthdays and their favorite holidays. Again, that is as we're moving into that acceptance stage. Those first anniversaries without your loved ones, those first birthdays can be very difficult. The first Christmas, the first New Year's, all of those things can be very difficult. So those are times that I really encourage individuals to come collectively together with those that are closest to you and celebrate. This is not the time to be alone and isolate, even though you may feel like that's what's best for you. But being around your loved ones and your closest friends as you embark on those reoccurring birthdays and those reoccurring anniversaries and that and our loved ones' favorite holidays is really key. Those that are closest experience the deepest pain. I remember when again my dad passed away in 2007, and then I remember vividly when my father-in-law passed away. And that was a very heavy time in our household because my husband not only planned the services, he planned everything, but then he also eulogized his father. And we had to travel, and all of those things we had to account for. And it's said that the individuals that sit on that first pew in the church are the ones that are impacted the most. And this was my husband and I's first shared loss together in our marriage. And I will be very honest, again, honest and transparent in your best unleashed. I promised you that. Was sitting on that front pew and looking at my husband in that pulpit eulogizing his father. I felt powerless. I felt helpless because I knew that he was going through pain. But he stood there and he honored his father and he eulogized him. But that degree of pain that I experienced, I can't imagine what he was going through as his son and having to eulogize his father. So it is key and critical that you have the opportunity and take the time to be around those that are closest to you, your loved ones and your family members. Because it's key and critical because we're moving forward to have to create a new normal. So, as we begin to wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with some key points for today. The first point that I want to leave you with is that your love for your loved one never dies, and neither does your grief. Some people say, as I said before, it'll get better with time. But that's not necessarily the case. Doesn't always get better with time. It's what you do with the time in order for it to get lighter. So it doesn't get better, but it may get lighter. So in that time, as we're going through the stages, again, how do you utilize the time? Well, are you spending time again with family and friends and loved ones? Are you talking about your deceased loved one in a safe space? Perhaps again, you need to see a grief and loss therapist. Perhaps you may need to go to a support group. Okay, so that is what you're doing with your time in order for the grief to become lighter. Again, another tip, I will never tell a person who is grieving to move on because there is no moving on. Again, it's about your grief becoming lighter and your grief shifting in terms of the love that you have trapped inside of you. How do you then express that outwardly? And then, lastly, as I stated before, our grief comes in waves. It comes in waves. All right. So, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, New Year's, anniversaries of their passing, it all comes in waves. right? We all, again, are going to grieve. It is a universal human experience. And the pain of grief is inevitable. But the suffering associated with grief, remember that is optional. We don't have to suffer. So if I were to leave you all with anything on today, I would say it is key and critical that those of us that are survivors, that we are not grieving ourselves to death. So make sure that you are sitting in the space. You're sitting in that space of grief. Remember that you are not alone. And remember that the pain is inevitable, but your suffering is optional. I want to thank you for taking this opportunity to join me today on Your Best Unleashed. I know that this was a heavy topic, but it's a needed topic. If you have not subscribed to my channel, I want to take this opportunity to invite you to do so. For those of you all that have joined the Your Best Unleashed community, I want to thank you for being with us and being faithful listeners. Thank you so much. And this has been your episode of Your Best Unleashed.